Our submarine project to build ourselves 12 new submarines. Surely it has now got to be scrapped. Now, this project costed over its lifetime at $250 billion, not billion, trillion dollars, was always looking like a disaster from the get-go, and it's unravelling already. Right from the start, the Turnbull government made two absolutely critical mistakes through political cowardice and greed. First, it said these submarines had to be diesel, not nuclear, because the government didn't have the guts for a public fight about nuclear power in this country. And that meant our new subs, if they ever get built, will be slower than today's nuclear submarines, their range will be much less, and they won't be able to stay underwater as long. Second, the Turnbull government said these submarines had to be built, at least substantially, in Adelaide. And why? Because it thought that would save Liberal seats there. But that meant that our new submarines will be much more expensive. We can't, not buying them cheaper off the peg from overseas. And it's also one reason why we will get them much later. In fact, and this is the killer, we're not expected to get the first of these submarines for another 14 or 15 years. And the last one we won't get until 35 years from now, decades after we actually need it. Can someone please ask China to wait for us until we finally get fully armed? Here is a contrast. The US Navy last December ordered 9 Virginia-class nuclear submarines for just $30 billion, the first of them to be delivered in just 5 years. But now, the joke today is that the French who are building our subs say, whoops, they probably can't build that much of them in Australia after all. And that, only that, is what had our politicians arguing in Parliament today.
This government asserted to Australian workers that 90% of the future submarines contract would be local content. So why on earth is there no binding percentage requirement for local content in the government's contract for the future submarines?
We are delivering a sovereign defence capability, and as I said in my last answer, mandating a minimum portion of Australian industry, particularly at this time during the design phase, would be counterproductive.
Can you believe it? That's what gets them excited. They're arguing about how many local jobs. Why aren't they arguing instead about whether we are spending $250 billion on dud subs, leaving our defences weaker? Now, I was joined earlier by security expert Clive Williams. He was a former Director of Security Intelligence for the Defence Force. Clive Williams, thank you so much indeed for your time. The submarine project, should it be scrapped?
I think it should be scrapped in its present form, because I think that what we should be looking at is nuclear-powered submarines, and they cost roughly $4 billion each, and that's what the US, UK and France only operate now.
And is it just a cost thing for you that it'll be cheaper, or are there other considerations?
Well, I think that trying to create jobs in Australia for a complex project like this is a bit counterproductive. I know I was in defence when the Collins-class submarines were being built, and there were all sorts of issues because of lack of local knowledge, which meant you had to train up local manufacturers. There were issues between incompatible systems, using French and American systems in some areas. There were different manufacturers who didn't want to share their copyrighted technologies. There were a lot of problems. It's much easier to buy a complete unit or even lease a unit, and that would be even a cheaper option. But I favoured the Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, which the Americans are building a new class of at the moment, an updated version. And I think that would have been ideal for us, and that would have cost us not more than $4 billion each.
And they would have arrived here much sooner. One of the things that worries me about this project is that we've got submarines that even now, the first one of these 12 will not come into our possession until, what, 14 years from now? The last one about 35 years from now. No one knows whether we need submarines of this kind by then at all. And also, you can't operate a fleet of subs with only one or two and wait for the cavalry to come, the rest of them to come later. Does that delay concern you at all?
It certainly does, because I think essentially what we're looking at is something that's obsolete now. Putting a diesel engine in a nuclear-powered submarine is rather like putting a diesel engine in a Tesla. You know, it's a sort of, it's not the thing we should be doing. And to be looking at 12 submarines, I think, is ridiculous. We've only ever been able to raise 4 crews for the Collins. And if the Americans were running nuclear-powered submarines in Australia, they'd be having 2 crews per submarine. They'd probably do it with 2 submarines. And that's about the extent of what we need. And I think we've sort of really created a monster for ourselves.
So when you say we can't raise the crews, you mean there are only a limited number of people prepared to accept a job that requires them to sit in a tin can deep underwater, away from their families, away from communications for weeks and weeks on end?
That's right. A submarine nowadays usually has around 60 crew. As we've only been able to raise 4 crews, we were never able to put all of the Collins-class submarines to sea at any one time. I don't think that situation will change, because I suspect that the millennials will be even more attracted to their smartphones and their contact with the internet and so on. You know, and putting them off in isolation for a protracted period, I don't think the money would be an attraction for them when perhaps the social issues are more important.
Now, Clive Williams, how did we get into this unholy mess where we have a program that's worth nearly $250 billion that won't give us submarines until far, far too late, when they may well be obsolete by the time we even get them, where you can't perhaps find even the crews to get them, where they're slower and perhaps not to our needs, given that they're diesel, where we don't even know the design will work, and where the only problem, the only argument in Parliament today was, oh, look, whether they'd create enough jobs in Adelaide. I mean, how did we get to the stage where the elected government of Australia chose a kind of submarine that was clearly not what we needed at a price we can't afford?
Well, of course, the Navy, when they were looking at designs for future submarines, they were told specifically they couldn't have a nuclear-powered submarine because the government was worried about being able to sell that to people. But I don't think that would be a hard sell. I mean, if you can say that all your allies are operating those kinds of submarines without any problems, I don't see that there would be an issue with that. But it's a nonsense, and I guess the governments, you know, who obviously were interested in creating jobs, haven't really been thinking beyond that and not prepared to say, well, this is it, we need to walk away and have another rethink. I mean, the Audit Office is already saying that the costs are blown out considerably, and it's likely to continue to be the case. And of course, all of these design issues that I referred to previously in terms of, you know, incompatibility of systems and whatever, I think it's a dead duck, frankly, and I think the government should accept that and admit that and start looking at nuclear-powered submarines.
Clive Williams, thank you very much indeed for your time.
My pleasure, Andrew.